Greetings all. We made it to the end of the day here, and I'm actually going to jump right in with highlighting just a few of the experiences and expertises of this assembled panel, just so you get a sense of their real depth and breadth of knowledge on the subject area of water. It was very encouraging as we prepared for this, how quickly and well-reasoned they would come up with the responses to the many questions I had. In fact, I had about 20 questions I wanted to bring here, but I was gently reminded we only have 75 minutes, so I had to cut that list down. Otherwise, Mickey or perhaps considering the audience, a bartender might kick us out. So I figured 8 or 9 questions here would be a good start, and if you have more to add, please add them to the Whova app. Brett's going to dance a jig if anything really good comes in that we need to ask the assembled panel here. But with that, starting from furthest away but closest to me in proximity on the stage is Brett. Brett Bovee is the president of Water Research based in Fort Collins. Brings 20 years of experience conducting a variety of engineering, economic, and water rights studies across the western United States. Since joining Westwater, Brett has performed dozens of focused water rights evaluation studies and broader economic and water market analyses. He actively assists clients in buying water rights, evaluating water supply risk, and planning for future water challenges. He combines his background in water resource engineering with a knowledge of water rights and economics to bring us his unique perspective on this topic. Next, we have Erica Small, an investor and civil engineer with expertise in municipal finance and water infrastructure. She's a municipal analyst, research analyst at Breckenridge Capital Advisors in Boston, where she covers the Western U.S. and serves as the team's environmental policy expert to guide ESG strategies. Dr. Small has previously held positions in engineering and consulting firms in Colorado, where she worked on flood and drought modeling and resiliency and design projects. She has published in many peer-reviewed journals on topics ranging from risk pricing in the municipal bond market to water service options for shrinking cities. She holds a BS in civil engineering from Penn State, an MS in civil and environmental engineering from Colorado State, and a PhD in environmental policy from Duke. And last but not least is Mary Ellen, our Florida native on the panel here. She is the assistant. Mary Ellen Winkler is the assistant executive director with the St. Johns River Water Management District in Northeast Florida. That's around Jacksonville area. She has been with the district since 1999, and prior to her current role, she rose to the position of general counsel. While in the Office of General Counsel, her primary areas of practice included consumptive use, environmental resource permitting, and water supply planning. Mary Ellen has represented the district in many cases before the Florida Division of Administrative Hearings. She graduated with high honors from the University of Florida College of Law, has a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from University of Central Florida, and earned a Master's in Engineering and Environmental Engineering from the University of Florida. So greetings to this researched and intelligent panel here. So we'll just start off with kind of 2 sections. First section talks a little bit more, or we're going to cover more of water cycle supply and demand. And we'll start with what are the stresses being felt in the water supply today, and can you attribute any causes? Maybe we'll start with Mary Ellen and work this way.
Okay, good afternoon. Well, as you stresses, we're actually sitting in what's known as the Central Florida Water Initiative area. And one of the stresses we are having in this area is, of course, growing population and demand for water resources, public supply water. So growing population, growing demand, one big factor that we're trying to meet the need. On the environmental side of the house, we're really trying to balance. Here we have, in the state of Florida, in this area, the Floridan Aquifer. And we're at that point where we're reaching utilizing the sustainable yield of that aquifer. So we're having to find alternative resources to meet the growing demand. The other thing I'd say in terms of stresses that we're feeling in the area are changing climate. We're seeing climate patterns, rainfall patterns are changing. So changes in evapotranspiration rates, other things that really affect how much water will be available. So there's a lot of pressure to find water for growing population and then just changing environmental conditions.
Thank you. Erica?
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. I guess there's a couple things I want to talk about in the water sector in general, probably most of them related to the specific infrastructure, but since we're first talking about the water supply, I'll say that sort of two things I pay attention to, and I'm not like a regional expert, so Mary Ellen's more of an Eastern expert. Brett is definitely more of like a Western US expert, and I would say I'm just sort of a generalist in my understanding of water in US. But I think that a lot of people don't really understand that in parts of the country that have a lot of water, so not in the West, there's still a lot of issues with emerging contaminants and then salinity, even if you're not going to be inundated from sea level rise, because of pressure differentials, you can have salt water in your water supply, and that's going to be really tricky and really expensive for utilities to be thinking about. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I guess I agree with both of them, and I kind of put stresses in the water sector in 3 buckets. One is supply demand, which Mary Ellen talked about. One is infrastructure and the aging infrastructure. So a lot of our water infrastructure that we use today is several decades old. And it could be 80, it could be 50, but it is typically several decades old. And that creates some replacement needs. And then the third bucket would be quality. Emerging contaminants, definitely a concern, especially in groundwater systems. But also just continued regulation of surface water systems and how we're implementing the Clean Water Act and dealing with non-point source pollution. I mean, these are sort of nationwide challenges in the water supply sector. And I guess, show of hands, I'm just curious about water supply risk, because I have a perspective on it, but by show of hands, who has seen like a water supply risk news article in the last week? Okay, yeah, I think we are generally paying more attention to water supply risks, and I do think the risks have been increasing, but I also think parallel to that is we're just doing a better job at like making it a conversation in our dialogue and in what we're doing, and so it actually is somewhat assuring to me that we are having conversations about these things, because I think for a long time our water supplies and the water we use was largely just a given. Like, the water will come out of your faucet clean, pressurized, and reliable. And that's the way it was, and will continue to be, in my view, for a very long time. But, you know, I think the conversation around this isn't just a sure thing to have this come out of our faucet. It's probably a healthy place to be. So, but yeah, those are the 3 stresses that I see in the water sector, for sure. And if I can touch just upon the supply-demand one, I think it's helpful to think about it as both a supply and demand balance to think about, because at the same time, climate change and changes in precip and temperature are all contributing to sort of modifications to our supply and how it comes. We are also at the same time a growing population in many areas, a diversifying economy, and we are paying more attention to the need for the water resource need of the environmental sector. So healthy streams, healthy aquifers, and that's a demand in my mind. We are trying to do better. We're not just depleting the resource every drop. And that supply-demand balance is really, I think, what is overall the stress, is we are putting more demands on these resources while also dealing with the supply side.
Yeah, I think everybody is aware of the record low levels now, Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and that's kind of one of the things that really brought this topic to my mind, and that's been going on for years. But can you talk about any differences between eastern and western states in that supply dynamic?
I'll touch briefly on it. The main divide in my mind, because I deal a lot with water rights, which are a Western creation. In the West, the governments and state governments are who manage the resources. So the federal government does not manage the resource. Each state allocates out rights to be able to pull water out of a creek, to be able to pull water out of the ground, out of groundwater aquifers. That's a state agency, that's a state creation of giving you the right to do that, and the right gives you specific conditions on how you can do that. That really only exists in that form basically the Dakotas to Texas and west. In the east, it was largely allocation of the resource or use of the water resource was simply, I'm next to it, I can use it. And that still is largely the way it's managed today. I would say that increasingly, because some of the supply-demand dynamics, I'm seeing a permit system get introduced. And the permit system is not a water right like in the West, but it is a step towards the direction of we can't just have a free-for-all. We've got to have some limits on who can use the resource for what purpose. And the most I've seen the eastern states get to is there's a permit system, everyone has to be permitted, and then they pick some date, maybe it's 2011 or maybe it's 2005, but there's some date that says everyone before this date, grandfathered in, you can use your water, but we're going to be pretty stringent on the permits we issue after this date, because there's a realization, again, that there's just not enough supply to meet all the needs. And so there's going to have to be some regulation, which starts to look a lot like Western water rights. And so I think there's big differences, but I think over time, those differences across the eastern and western parts of our country are blending more.
I might jump to Mary Ellen here because I know she deals with this legally.
So, no, and it's important to understand, I think, both systems and how they developed in terms of Western and prior appropriation, really more of a property rights context. The development in the eastern United States, where there was the wetter climate, was really you'd have a water body and everyone divided up their use and everybody had a reasonable use of the water. Florida, for example, has moved into what I would say it's a regulated riparianism, where we have borrowed concepts from Western water law. So it does belong, we have here in the state of Florida a permitting system. The agency that I represent, we are the agency charged with that duty. The water belongs, the state holds the water in trust for the people of the state of Florida. And so you do get a permit, and it is for a limited duration. So in Florida, for example, every 20 years, you have to demonstrate all the criteria for issuance all over again. And it's at that point, a determination is made, is this in the public interest to keep this particular use? We've definitely, and there's an allocation similar to Western water law. So it's not just dividing things up. And I think that it developed, back in the common law days, you didn't know you had a problem under the riparian system until one of those users of the pond went, you're hurting me, you're interfering with my water use. Now that we have borrowed the concept from Western water law of looking at an allocation and doing this analysis up front, there's more assurance. And I also agree with you, Brett, that Western has grabbed some Eastern concepts where you're looking at more, there's now an allocation of beneficial use is recognized as the environment. It's not just farming or municipal and other things. There's now a space for environmental use. So it's interesting as time has evolved. I agree with you. I think there were these two constructs, and I think as time is progressing, we're borrowing the best of each and coming up with a statutory construct that borrows from both. And it's funny, the term in riparian was a reasonable use, was kind of the term of art. In Western, it was beneficial. Florida's statute says it has to be a reasonable beneficial use, interestingly enough. So it's definitely evolving, and I think borrowing from both.
On the topic of supply, what are some alternatives then? Like, 'cause we think about rainfall, and we have our lakes and rivers and various aquifers. What alternatives might be out there that we could use or leverage?
Yeah, I guess I'll go on this. I'm definitely not like a water law expert, so, but this topic I do know a little bit about. So, yeah, so traditionally, if you look at, most people in the room here are analysts, I think. I'm an analyst. you look at disclosure from a particular utility and they're gonna talk about their water supply. Often they have some sort of stack of water supply, but usually you're getting something from surface water, so like a reservoir or river, or groundwater, or some combination of the two. Increasingly, we're seeing some of the sort of best issuers and utilities and water districts kind of looking for alternative water supplies that come from, reuse and recharge, although that's a little bit contentious. I mean, some people just don't feel great about consuming water that once was wastewater, and that's a whole thing that I know a lot of cities are trying to contend with right now. People are talking about desal. I do think that we'll get there in parts of our country, and it's just going to take a while. And again, that will be really expensive. So I actually personally don't really see these like expensive, big capital intensive things as being the solution to water. I think that eventually we're going to end up getting there and people will pay what they need to pay to have water. I actually think more and more we're just going to see a really diverse portfolio of groundwater and surface water that's going to be coming in from further away from a particular issuer. I mean, right now in general, because water is so bulky and it's really expensive to transport, a lot of the water that we all consume is very local. It's derived locally. And I think that in the sort of interim, before we get to a time and place when desal is more widely used, for example, I think that you're just going to have a more diverse portfolio. But that's just my opinion. I don't know.
I was just going to say, just in this area alone, there's a significant amount of reclaimed water use, particularly for irrigation. I'd say that's probably number one alternative water supply. People are also here, if you notice driving in, we have lots of stormwater ponds. Stormwater ponds are becoming a source of water for irrigation. Brackish, we're going to not so much desal, but that interim step of brackish wells, particularly as you go around 1,000 feet down here in this area, you can get a brackish well. And what that does by going deeper, it minimizes the environmental impact to springs and other things. So people are looking at not only where can I find water, but how can I do it in such a way as not to provide and negatively impact the environment. So we're seeing more brackish wells, I'd say more recently. So there's a lot out there that folks, and I think you're exactly right, the diversified portfolio is definitely something that we see a lot more of.
I had one thing to add.
Sure.
One way to think about it is, the freshwater sources that we've all used, particularly for the municipal or industrial or commercial uses, is sort of the low-hanging fruit because it's the least cost to turn that raw water source into what needs to get through the system and to our uses. So we've plucked all the low-hanging fruit. Like that's in most places that's true. So we're going to the upper branches there, and it's basically the dirty water. I mean, it's brackish. It's the water that went down your sink. It's the sewer flows. I mean, these are the sources we're turning to, treating them at higher costs. And so I think that's something to just pay attention to in this room is my perspective is generally we've used all the freshwater sources in a lot of places. It's a very local issue, as it was said, but in a lot of places we've used the cheap freshwater sources, and the cost of the next increment of supply will be substantially more expensive. And I have a very Western states view on that, so that's tainted. But that's my view in the Western U.S. is that next increment of supply might be 3-4 times the cost of the supply you're dealing with right now because of treatment, because of conveyance, for whatever reason. So that's a challenge for the municipal sector in general.
So with those added costs of maybe new supply coming online, and then you layer that over infrastructure that's as old as it is, right? How do those kind of combine to maybe create, I don't want to say quite a nightmare scenario, but obviously a challenge, I think, for municipalities as they're trying to deliver water through infrastructure, convey it, and get it to where it needs to go so people turn the tap and there's water.
Mm-hmm.
I can go on this one? Sure. So I think on The infrastructure side, obviously there's a lot of ways that water can impact our infrastructure, and then our infrastructure can then in turn impact our water. I think that, most people in the room here understand that water is really capital intensive. The water sewer sector is a big part of the municipal bond market. That's because it's really expensive to build and maintain water infrastructure. And yeah, a lot of it's aging, but, there's also new stuff going in the ground all the time around the country, and that costs a lot of money. I think that as an engineer, one thing I came to appreciate is just how difficult it is to actually design water projects. And it's because it sounds really silly and almost trivial, but like when you actually think about the implications of that, water is a flowing resource. It doesn't stay stagnant, at least not without barriers, right? Like a reservoir. It is something where the supply is always fluctuating. It's really, really difficult to predict with a really high degree of accuracy what's going to happen for these various storm and flood events. And then we'll have these things like prolonged droughts. So the supply is fluctuating, it's moving, it's bulky, and then demand is also fluctuating. But the infrastructure that we all often take for granted, because you don't even see it, at least not often, is fixed, and it has to be fixed, and it has to be designed for your max capacity, because when things like what these atmospheric rivers happen in California, if the infrastructure isn't designed for max capacity, then you have a whole nother set of failures. And that's a problem, I think, in both the eastern and western United States for kind of different reasons. I think in the eastern US, you have more water supply, but in general, especially in the Northeast and sort of like the Midwest Rust Belt, you've been losing population. Even if that's stabilized, you've been losing population. And those places were designed for a much higher capacity, a much higher water use over time. Also, across the board, in general, we've just gotten more efficient in how we use water. So in general, water use has gone down, domestic water use, commercial water use. You contrast that with like the Southwest or parts of the Southeast that are growing like crazy, still are, and they too still have to design for max capacity. So they're like, oh, our population grew, 8% last year. We think that's going to maintain for the next decade. And so they project that out, and then guess what? The infrastructure gets built to that amount. And if the growth still continues, but it's not at 8%, then all of a sudden you also have a system where you have risk of, at least a semi-stranded asset. So I think that like the supply-demand fluctuation stuff is hugely important and really, really difficult. I'm not exactly sure what you do, but I think
aware of it.
Yeah, exactly.
I was just going to say, one of the other costs, I think, I'd say for utilities here in Florida and probably elsewhere on the water quality side, on the sewer type aspect of this, in the state, we're trying to be very careful about nitrogen and phosphorus being released back into the environment. And so a lot of folks are going to advanced treatment technology, which then increases the cost. So you've got the coming in the door, trying to find the resource, and then the treatment train going out the door is just increased costs on both ends of the spectrum for them. So I think making it very difficult.
Shifting gears just a little bit more to the demand side. So what considerations factor into a district's decision to grant permitting for highest and best use of water? And how are the various rights potentially adjudicated between competing claims?
So an example here, we have permitting criteria, as we talked about earlier. We've gone towards a statutory framework. So we have rules that govern, down to, if you're growing a particular crop, what you can get for that allocation. For municipal water supply, it's population and looking at your per capita use. And so you get an allocation. So we have rules that for each category, industrial, commercial, agriculture, municipal supply, how those projections and allocations are determined. You take that and then you look at your modeling. How much of the resource can I take? How much can I withdraw without causing harm, impacting other legal users of water? So there's a list of criteria that we go through in an analysis. We have computer models. I mean, it's an intensive process. And then, there are competition issues. And so when we get ready to issue a permit, we provide public notice, and there can be a challenge. And so that's when you end up in an administrative hearing with a judge, and you have the competing experts, and in order from the judge, ultimately, and it usually boils down to the criteria. Most commonly, it's the environmental harm criteria, and then whether whether your withdrawal will impact another existing legal use of water. So it's an intensive process. Municipalities put a lot of time and energy into their consumptive use permit applications. And so it's a long process. We work with them. In the state of Florida, again, we give 20-year permits because that does give them some certainty because they've expended funds. There is an opportunity in Florida, if you have bonds, to get longer duration permits if you need time to retire those bonds. So there are mechanisms within state statute here to address bond issues, and that for the development of alternative water supplies. So there is a framework to help on that front. I don't know about the western side, how their process.
It's actually super interesting to hear that. I can give a little context on western states and how they manage the resource. And I would say there largely isn't any government review of sort of highest and best use or how your use compares to an allocation, which is really interesting because the West has water supply issues, right? But I would say the level of critique is significantly less. And really what it's structured around is these water rights that you hold are your right to take water from a source. And they define how much, where, when, for what purpose. But that's it. And so long as you live within that right, and a lot of these rights were established 1875, 1882, 1903. They were established, long ago. And so long as you live within the bounds of those rights, that's written into the water right, you can use that. And there's not really a revisiting of that. That right, for purposes of certainty and investment, that owner can use that water right under those terms indefinitely. And it's just interesting to see there's so much less critique of use compared to the Florida situation. It's really just these are the terms of the water right. And the one thing I'll say about certainty is that's the way people have got accustomed to managing. So if your supply doesn't feel sufficient or you feel like you need more resource, you go acquire water rights to improve your situation with the confidence that if I spend X million dollars acquiring these rights, no one's going to come back and say, we reviewed your portfolio and you should use less. And so the system has built up, and it may not be perfect, but one thing it is there's a lot of certainty around that there is not really a government review going to second guess your use of those rights. Your rights are your rights. And that's how the West has kind of grown up over the last 150 years.
I know Colorado has a lot of ditch companies,
They do.
essentially. And I don't know, is that in other states, West? And maybe you want to explain a ditch company a little bit to
Yeah, so in the West, we have to irrigate crops. I think there's a bit of irrigation that happens in the East, and it's growing because your yields can get improved and quality can get improved in the crops. But in the West, you pretty much can't grow a whole lot without irrigation. And back in the early 1900s, our government policy was let's expand irrigation and agriculture as much as possible. The Reclamation Act was signed, and we built Hoover Dam. We built dozens of other dams and storage projects, primarily to irrigate ground, as an economic engine of the West. So I'm going to get to your question. So agriculture depends on the area, but let's call it 70 to 80% of the water use in the West is for irrigated agriculture. It's to grow crops, it's to grow hay to feed cattle, and there's kind of three buckets of irrigating ground. You have ditch companies, you've got irrigation districts, and you've got private water rights. So I'll run through these quickly. Ditch companies were a group of people, typically back, late 1800s. They came out west. They said, gosh, we got to get the water from this river over there. I can't do that on my own, but hey, how about you, me, and this other guy? We all do it together. We'll pool our funding. So mutual ditch companies got formed where they pooled their funding, they pooled their resources. They each got a share of the company stock, basically. And then they all get to share in the benefits, that labor and that resource. That's an irrigation company. Irrigation districts were basically the ground served by reclamation projects. Basically these projects were built. You owning land in this area means you get the benefits of the project that was built. And then private water rights are what they sound like. I, long ago, might have diverted water from this water source, and I've irrigated ground with it, and that's my isolated water right holding. It doesn't relate to shares in a company or a big federal project. It's just a private water right. So there's these buckets of types of water rights, specifically for irrigation in the West, that are, it's really important because as I said, irrigation, the activity of irrigating crops, still makes up about 70 to 80% of our overall water use in the Western states.
Did you have anything to add here, Erica? Or?
No, I can't follow
Yeah.
on dish companies. Yeah.
Litigation, obviously, pending or in process around the Colorado River Compact. So let's talk first about that, and then is there anything there that might inform us on, a more broad-reaching litigation, or is there any similar type of situation in the East that anyone's aware of that we might see in the news here soon?
I might touch around the Colorado and then ask you. I know there's Eastern things, but I'm not super familiar with them. So the Colorado River Basin is in trouble. Maybe you heard about this. I think every news outlet in our country, at least major ones, have reported on this. It's sort of a sexy topic. But it's well deserved. It is in trouble. And my numbers, and I think they're not terribly wrong, is in the whole watershed, which stretches from Wyoming and Colorado down to the Gulf of Mexico, in that watershed, to get in balance, you've got to take out 1 out of every 3 acres of cropland or 2 out of every 3 people. That's the supply-demand balance that watershed's dealing with. And the only reason that things aren't more dire is because for the last 20 years, we built these huge storage reservoirs. Our 2 largest reservoirs in our country are in that watershed, that basin, and something like 80% of their storage has been depleted over the last 20 years. So basically, people often use the bank account analogy. We've just been living off savings since 2000. 2000 was the last time those reservoirs were near full. And for the last 23 years, we've just lived off the savings because the checking account is deaded every year in a big way. And that's the basic balance of that basin. And this is like slow-moving train that's hard to get out of the way kind of analogy. Nothing fast is going to happen. And so, there's a lot, I think there was a comment on the last panel of a lot of lively discussion and debate. That's what's happening in the Colorado River Basin right now, because how do you take decades of water demand that's been established and all of a sudden call it a third of the demand in the basin? Just that needs to go away in order for us to have a sustainable water supply demand balance. It's really challenging. Luckily, we got a 1 good year. That 1 good year is not going to solve this problem. It's helpful. It's turned the corner, but it's not going to help solve it. So I just want to express that basin has issues, and the news articles are pretty accurate in depicting it as such.
I guess I'll say some sort of general things about it because I'm less of a Colorado River expert, but definitely I think that that's a great example of something that I talk about a lot, something that I guess I spent a lot of time sort of when I was researching this, is that water in the United States is this crazy amalgam of different levels of government. And I think also people kind of fail to fully appreciate that. So with the Colorado River Compact, the federal government's obviously involved. The Bureau of Reclamation oversees those 2 major dams. they basically are going to step in, and no one knows exactly what the reallocation looks like, but something's going to happen with the federal government. But in general, the federal government has allowed this to be in control of the states that are all involved in the Colorado River Basin. And then obviously below the level of states, you have municipal governments, water utilities, and then like individual water users and agricultural users that all make for this very messy sort of layer cake of who is in charge of the water regulations. And I think that translates to other parts of the country too. I mean, Mary Ellen's more of an expert on Eastern water, but you know, there have been similar interstate water wars in the East, and so like a big one is in the ACF basin, and that's groundwater based, but it's sort of the same story, right? Where there's a growing area, that's Atlanta, Georgia, basically, and then that's taking water away from other uses in Florida, and that's resulted in a massive lawsuit. So like, I think that the sort of the cooperative federalism, as I've heard it called, with water, because it doesn't just stay within these confined boundaries, makes for just a really complex situation, which makes honestly like being a bond analyst who's trying to like understand water risk kind of difficult sometimes.
I was just going to add, the Florida-Georgia lawsuit and the effects essentially of what's going on in Atlanta and the effects on the Apalachicola Bay here in Florida, hugely important. I think one of the answers, and I think as we're talking about development of this regulatory, statutory framework, as we move from the common law to the statutory framework in Florida, I think one of the really wise things, and we were at early on, we did our Florida Water Resources Act from 1972, so last year, 50th anniversary. So we were, I think, on the forefront of going toward a more statutory, moving away from the common law. One element of that statute, and it's evolved a little bit over time and put more meat on the bones of it, is water supply planning. And I think going forward, that is something I think other states maybe should look at and would recommend that they do, because I think it's served us well. In Florida, what we're required to do is we have to do, for areas where we predict that in a 20-year horizon, if we're not going to have enough water, where there won't be quantities available, and they have to be quantities that are available in a way that you're not going to hurt natural systems. We have to go through a water supply planning exercise to make sure that we've identified enough sources and projects, water supply development projects or water resource development projects, to make sure that we have enough water for the population in 20 years. So we just are in that exercise. We completed a plan for this, actually, where we're sitting in 2020, the update for that plan. Those plans have to be updated every 5 years. So every part of our district, we cover 18 counties in Florida. We have 3 different water supply plans for different areas of our district. But we're constantly in that planning exercise so that we hopefully don't find ourselves in that situation where we're kind of living on borrowed time. So just want to advocate that I think just nationally is something that I think would be, something others could look at, because I think it has served us well.
Hey, can I add one thing?
Sure.
Little perspective on the Colorado Basin, and so you might ask, well, why have we gotten here? And one of the reasons is because we have a hard time, for good reason, cutting water to municipal uses. And the way things have progressed in the Colorado River Basin and other western states is the agricultural rights have the first right. They actually have the legal right to use water first. And the municipal growth has come later, like in the last 30, 40 years. So from a pure legal standpoint, what should happen is the ag rights get to keep using the water, and you cut water use to the municipal sector. But for health and safety reasons, nobody has the appetite to tell a municipal entity that half their supply has to go away or more. Like it's just not something we do as a society. So there's this sort of imbalance between what we are politically and socially willing to do and what the law says we should do. And that's why in the Colorado River Basin, you haven't seen cuts of the order of magnitude that we need, is because while the municipal sector has done a really good job in conservation, and I applaud them, like municipal conservation has been a success story over the last 30 years, a huge success story, but it's just not enough, and nobody's willing to cut that type of use. And so you're stuck with this framework where you legally don't have the tools or the appetite to cut the water uses back in balance. And I think we've just had this struggle for a long time. So just some more context on that, please.
Thank you. Last kind of question on this top section here. First section is water quantity versus water quality. There are some issues here, and what are the trade-offs really as an analyst? Like if there's a reservoir or a retention pond which is going to be used for irrigation purposes, okay, you can't build another set of pipelines to necessarily resupply a very broad area. So how do we bridge kind of some of this quantity versus quality needs and uses?
I'll jump in here. So as an analyst, I personally don't really think you can focus or put more weight on one than the other. I think it really all just depends on the context. I will say that with water supply in particular, versus sort of the treatment side, I think there is a point in time where the water supply quantity issues will require utilities or any sort of water user to make a wholesale switch to a different source, whereas water quality issues in general, there's a lot more appetite to try to basically treat the existing water. But as more and more contaminants come online, we're seeing more scenarios where, again, the water supply is being switched from an existing to something new altogether. So like an example is this PFAS stuff. Now the new MCL is quite stringent, and it's actually lower than what a lot of states have already had in place. And while currently I think a lot of utilities have been able to temporarily turn off wells, for instance, and then figure out a treatment and then go back and have those wells treated, once that's across the board, if the water supply is contaminated enough with something like PFAS, it might actually be more cost effective to just look elsewhere, depending on where you are in the country. So I do think that that's something to watch, is just sort of scenarios where the utility or water user is able to make use of the current supplies and the current quality of that versus when they're going to have to make this wholesale switch. Because obviously a wholesale switch for water supply is really costly, can result in all sort of political battles depending on where you are in the country. And I think that we're going to see those sort of decisions being played out a little bit more.
I think I would just build on that, just saying that as we're dealing with consumptive use permit holders and particularly the utilities, there's a lot of concern about the emerging constituents and what final numbers are going to be. I think there's a lot of worry and how that's going to affect the bottom line, what they're going to have to do to treat, or if they're going to have to switch from a well field to something else. So there's a lot of concern there right now, a lot of unknown.
Can you just explain what PFAS is for everybody? And
Yeah,
MCL?
I think maybe most people, if you cover the water sewer sector, you probably know what it is, but they're polyfluorinated alkaline substances. I believe that's what it stands for. So they're a family of forever chemicals, and these are in everything from, honestly, probably a lot of the clothes that we all are wearing or have worn. So like rain jackets actually have a lot of PFAS. Like a lot of the flame retardants and other things that are out there made by chemical companies are a big contributor. Nonstick cookware. So we all have PFAS in our blood and tissue. Like it's not just likely, like we definitely have PFAS in our blood and tissue. But some parts of the country have it even more so in their soils and waters, just given, if they had a treatment or a chemical plant in the vicinity.
And MCL? That's the
Maximum contaminant level. So an MCL is just that's what happens when the EPA Safe Drinking Water Act actually comes out with a set target that every drinking water utility in the country has to meet. So far, we have not had a federal MCL or national MCL for PFAS. It's all just been state specific, and some states have implemented a state level MCL, but nothing from the EPA. But the EPA came out and said that they have this final rule, and we're basically on like a runway now till we get there.
So with all those happy thoughts in mind, right, now moving on, like as a municipal bond investor and holders of municipal debt, not just the water bonds, but our water utilities, will start there, adequately pricing all these risks and these uncertainties that we've talked to into their system operations for customer billing.
No, I don't think so. There are some utilities that are really ahead of the curve. And I was talking with Brett at one point before this session about how we're all up here talking about like bad things related to the water sector. So there's a lot of downside risk, which is fair, and there should be some things that we're thinking about with having rating agencies further downgrading water utilities, utilities being further pressed on their balance sheets or their operations. But I also think there are some utilities that are doing well and are really ahead of the curve when it comes to trying to like diversify their water supply and really think about affordability. But I think in general, like our water utilities in general, I mean, there's 52,000 community water systems in the United States. Not all of them access the municipal bond market. I think about 70% of them do. So when I say is the water sector in general accurately and adequately, not accurately, but adequately addressing all of the risks that we're talking about? No. But I don't really fault the water utilities there. They basically have been dealt an extremely difficult hand, which is like managing this change of supply along with these emerging contaminants. And then they have all of these, really unfunded federal mandates. So drinking water has to, constantly meet all of these new guidelines. And all that costs a lot of money. And in our current model, they're not getting a lot of that from the federal government. So a lot of that is coming from bond proceeds, for instance. Yeah.
I think one thing that was said, which I agree with, is there is a sort of a structure of planning that goes into the water sector because of the complexities and all the things that need to be thought about. There is I'll say tried and true method of walking through water supply planning, walking through capital investment plans. This is becoming routine, and I'd say if utilities or municipalities are on that path of doing the right types of planning, I think they're going to continue to be pretty well served by that. And despite all the things we talked about in the earlier part of this panel, like they're going to continue to provide a quality service of water, and they're going to get revenue to pay the debt. And so I think it's really where, in my mind, where people have deviated from doing the right planning steps. They haven't done CIP planning, capital infrastructure planning, in several years, or haven't updated costs. Or one area that I think could use a lot of improvement is sort of that iteration. The last panel talked a lot about iteration. There's an iteration of what do you want, can you afford it? And I think that doesn't happen enough in a lot of utilities. The engineering groups will say, well, all these supply factors are volatile and we need to build more storage, and so we need X million dollars to go, mitigate that risk. And risk and cost are sort of two levers, right? So you can fund a ton of stuff and reduce your risk. And that's sort of what comes out of the engineering side of those plans. But the financial analyst or the financial team at the city really needs to come back and say, well, what does that do on our demand? Like, if we need to raise water rates 2x, people are going to use a lot less water. And so you might not get the revenue, or you might not be able to build new homes fast enough. So the two areas I would say So I'll say planning is sort of the solution to adequately pricing all these risks in my mind. And the two areas I think that could use improvement is that feedback loop of what do you need to mitigate this risk in terms of infrastructure and what's the cost, and can you afford that? And there's an iteration there that I think needs to happen more. And then particularly in the West, the other area of improvement I could see, because the West in a lot of areas is sort of a growing population area, there's this feeling of just, we're going to grow like this, like the population growth chart is exponential and a big curve. And, there needs to be some critique of that in a way, because you don't build homes unless they have a water supply. This is a fundamental of a lot of Western communities, is if that new home doesn't have a robust water supply, it will not be built and won't be occupied. So nobody builds homes and then figures out the water supply. So your ability to build new supply projects at a price point where the home is affordable affects how many new customers you're going to have. And I think there should be some critique in if a bond is issued that is 100% paid by new homes, like that's how the revenue is going to come in to pay for that bond. There should be some level of critique of, does everything there make sense? Is the supply available for those new homes? Is it at a price point that that home is actually affordable? And that's the level of critique I think would be healthy.
Are there any covenants that we can ask of a utility? Like, hey, we need to see more days cash on hand for a water utility. Is that feasible? Or are these issues so long-lived, even if you have 2 years, that's 600 days of cash, can you really deploy it to help mitigate supply constraint or concern in a 1-year period of time?
I think in general, a lot of utilities they have a ton of cash. I think credit in the water sector is, for a lot of the sort of large to very large water utilities, is really strong, and the days cash is pretty outstanding. I actually don't think that we're going to get anywhere if we are just constantly are asking more from water utilities when it comes to rate covenants. Brett touched on it briefly, but like the affordability of water is a ticking time bomb. Maybe will be the thing that goes before like the infrastructure and water supply fails. Hopefully it never fails, but there's been some really good work that's come out of people that I worked with at Duke to try to actually, get a holistic understanding of water affordability for the whole U.S. This hasn't really been done, part of because it's kind of difficult. You have to make a lot of assumptions and like dig through customer billing. But I think across the country, the numbers are like, for about a third of Americans, water is not affordable right now. And as we've talked about, like, utilities are going to be making changes to their infrastructure, probably diversifying their water supply, having to meet new PFAS regulations and all sorts of other regulations that we're not even talking about. And so under our current business model with utilities, yes, we had a lot of federal money come in under Biden, but that's not forever. That's like a 5-year period, and a lot of that's come through SRFs. In general, state and local governments pay for water, and federal funding has, in general, dropped since about 1980. And so there's really no way that we're going to get to a place where like water supply is more sustainable in parts of the country without just impacting ratepayers, which is, we are all ratepayers. And I really, really worry about what that looks like from an affordability standpoint. Even in places that have a lot of high income places, like around, or a lot of high income households around the country, if water is like $350 a month, like I really don't think we're that far off from getting there. That's going to be a huge issue for affordability, and actually might like force the issue on changing the way we think about how we pay for water in the US. So I guess to answer your question, no, I don't think there should be more rate covenants on utilities. I think we need to kind of be thinking about other ways to feel more secure, I guess, as investors.
I'd just add, I'm not a bond expert like you, but we do look even in a permitting context at some of those affordability issues. One of our criterion in terms of that reasonable beneficial use of water is making sure that their utilities are using the lowest quality source available, that they're using reclaimed water to the maximum extent possible. And one of those factors that we looked at is it economically feasible to push a utility to do more in that arena? And one of the things, and I had a case where we were litigating that issue, and we looked at affordability. And once you push, for a median household income, once you push it, too far, it's a problem for those folks. So that's something that even in the permitting context, when we're working with utilities on their permits and trying to push those alternative water supplies, that affordability is becoming an issue and an important factor.
I had a question. Do you mind?
Go ahead.
Okay. Is affordability, is that universally accepted as, I think the EPA had a standard of like 2.5%
Yeah, 2.5 to
of median income? Is that universally accepted, like that's what affordability is? Like that's affordable or not, that 2.5%?
It became for us an evidentiary question. There was the EPA, and then there was another, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was in that 2.5 to 4% range, and some of the folks and expert witnesses we were working with were looking at here's what their rate was, and looking at the median household income for that particular municipality. And we made the decision in that case, like, okay, we can push them this far and no further, because we were going to go beyond what the EPA document. I mean, it was the best available information that we had at the time. But that's all that we had. But it is becoming an important, how far do you push? Because the pricing. The other thing that we see too is that for utilities, not all communities, but the city-owned or county-owned facilities, a lot of the revenue supports the general fund. And so we see that a lot, and that's also a very significant pressure for a lot of these local governments, that this is a revenue generation that, we'd like to see more investment in alternative resources, but they're also having to manage their own utility and reinvest in the utility, but they're also a major source of income for the city itself.
Sure.
So there's a very definite competing interest.
Can I add one thing on the affordability thing, just because I do think it's worthwhile talking about? So yes, in general, like the 2.5% of median household income is what people use. Probably like a lot of analysts use this, and then also kind of look at like the poverty percentage. S&P actually has a pretty good framework that they developed that I know a lot of analysts look at. Anymore though, from like the academic world, and increasingly now the policy world, there are people that are pushing to get away from that metric for all sorts of reasons. One is that like the median household income is not the best way to actually try to characterize a community's overall wealth. So there's some people that are advocating for using the lowest quintile of income in a community instead of the median as one. And then what I know some people have actually been pushing for is instead to look at hours spent at minimum wage to pay for your water bill. And the reason to use that is that minimum wage can vary depending on where you are in the country, and it's just like, it's a nice clear metric, but it gets a little bit more at like the actual burden on you, and like the poorest people in a particular community.
So if we're not going to look at rate covenants or liquidity covenants, most cities have these CIP plans for their utilities. Are those things that we should seek for disclosure on, Emma? I mean, do you have to really dig into a city's plan to really even try and find it? Is it even out there on the web, or is that something maybe we could start asking or trying to pursue? And who has the technical knowledge then to even understand what that plan might say?
I think, it's funny, I have learned more in bond offering documents about a municipal water utility than in anything they push out on the web. And it's partly because they need to disclose certain things about what they're looking to do, but there, at least in a lot of the places I work, there's a little bit of a competitive nature to water supply, and water districts, municipalities, they don't always just want to show everyone their plan. which says they're going to go do X, Y, and Z at A, B, C prices, because it's a competitive market out there to acquire new supplies and do things. And so, I mean, I think what I've seen is you have to dig really hard to find those types of things, except in bond documents.
Interesting. Kind of segue here then. So new development, like the city's obviously considering maybe zoning for some new development. What are the most relevant questions an investor might ask if that's either if it's a housing district or if it's new IDR? I mean, are there things we should be asking? Is it the city? Do we ask the water district? You know, how good are these rights? If we got a 30-year bond, I think you mentioned that there might be some variance for the life of that bond. But again, as an analyst, you know, what do we need to ask for a new development?
I have one thing. It goes back to what I said before, that I have this general perspective that if revenue to pay back the bond is based on existing customers and you're just talking about rate fluctuations, to me that feels pretty comfortable actually as a risk. What I think is more interesting to me from all the water supply risk things we talked about this morning is I've dealt with projects where the revenue was, we're going to go build 250 new homes or 2,500 new homes. That's the revenue to pay back this bond. And to me, that's where I think some analysis is needed, and that's actually what we were doing in that project, was evaluating not just the question of, is the water supply available to build 2,500 new homes in this area, but what does the cost look like to do it, and how does that affect home prices and the desire of the home builder to actually put up the house, thinking they're going to sell it for a price. And so I think that type of analysis where the revenue payback is growth based on growth projections, I think should deserve some analysis.
And we do get questions like that. We've had.
So I'm not the first municipal bond analyst to ever call you? Or?
No, yeah, we do get them from time to time. It's not very frequent, but we do get questions, particularly like if a local government wants to, there might be annexing in area to their service territory, that will get phone calls, well, if I need to serve this many people, is there, can I get a modification to my permit to increase my allocation? And so we do get those questions from time to time. And the other thing we've gotten questions from analysts here and there. We have areas in our district where we have minimum flows and levels. There's some north of here where we have a minimum flow set for outstanding Florida Springs. So we'll get questions, hey, you have this minimum level, is it being met? Is there a strategy, we call them in Florida prevention or recovery strategy? Does it have a plan to make it okay? Are there projects? So we get questions about if I annex, am I going to be okay? Can I get a mod? We get questions about water supply plan. Are they covered in the water supply plan? Do they have projects in the water supply plan? So not as frequently as I think you probably maybe to the west. And maybe it's because folks already know we have these water supply plans. They're publicly available. And so you can literally look in them. And for various projects, it'll tell you this project's available to these utilities. So in these plans, we have to identify how much, what the project is, how much water will be available, what utilities could potentially partake, and the kilogal cost. So it's a very open, here's what's available. So I think maybe people analysts avail themselves of that information that's just publicly available.
Is that on your district website?
It's on our website. We have all of our water supply plans, and in fact, for this area, the Central Florida Water Initiative has its own website, and that covers basically 3 water management districts actually kind of meet in the Orlando area, so we have a joint plan that covers this area, and there's a website, and it's got a list of projects, and here's how we plan to meet the next 20 years, and it's very, very detailed about what's available and out there.
Do you know, like, do other states, I mean, that sounds fairly developed.
Yeah, we're I mean, I think we're fairly robust in that. I don't know that others are. I think that's, there are surveys of where different states are in terms of planning. We are starting, in our North Florida planning area, we are starting to work more with Georgia, because water doesn't know, the aquifer doesn't know it's Georgia. You know, it's just, I think the Floridan aquifer actually extends all the way up to South Carolina. So our computer model for the northern part of our district extends all the way into South Carolina. So it doesn't know geopolitical boundaries. So I think we're recognizing more and more that we have to talk to each other and plan across those boundaries.
Erica, do you look at other districts and other states or anything where you're looking for water information at all in terms of disclosure that's publicly available? Or, you know, obviously you've studied it more in depth from an academic perspective than most of the municipal analysts in this room. It's kind of off the page here, but.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I'm always looking for water information, everywhere. No, I mean, I guess the question is just like.
Like, do you ever, like, if you're looking at a deal up in Massachusetts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where would you go? I mean, do you go to the city
Sure.
websites ever and look for their
Yeah,
plan? Or and
absolutely.
is that easily defined? Or are there any kind of aggregators of information on maybe regional plans for water development?
Yeah, depending on where you are in the country, you can maybe get some good data on like the actual water supply beyond just the drought risk monitor. But in general, I tend to advocate towards like going directly to the city government and seeing their disclosure. Once again, everyone in this room knows, and as we sort of talked about, you know, disclosure with utilities really varies in terms of quality. So it can make your job really easy or your job really difficult.
I guess last thing here, obviously, you know, in the news, apart from the macro events out west, you know, you do have the micro events of like a Flint, Michigan situation, currently Jackson, Mississippi. When I first started back in 2007, the Jefferson County warrants, that was a good time over in Louisiana. So what are some things that we should be looking at to support communities to make sure that we don't have these catastrophic events where, I mean, there's like no water delivery right now in Jackson. It's boil water, it's bottled water, you know.
Yeah, the thing with Jackson is a true tragedy. It's a true tragedy, and it's not, I don't think you can talk about Jackson without talking about a history of racism. That's absolutely a component of what's going on in Jackson and a component of what went on in Flint and Detroit, and honestly a lot of like the water system failures that have made the headlines. There's a history of that, and there's a reason that Jackson's water is the way it is. And a lot of that I do think has to go on with like all of the white flight from the city. So if you look at Jackson and the areas surrounding Jackson, in terms of like population decline and Black versus white residents, it's really stark. So like, to me, that's a shame for all sorts of reasons, but like in the United States, we should all care about that for a lot of things, a lot of reasons. One of them being, you know, Americans are very mobile, and we should be able to go anywhere in the country and have safe drinking water. And it's a problem for the residents there too, but we should all care about it, you know, like our own water security and ability to thrive in our country. So I guess to avoid something like that, this is a situation where I feel like, you know, the bond market can't solve it. It shouldn't be left to solve it, because the market's going to do what market's going to do, which is tend to take money in general to, you know, more affluent areas that are higher rated. That's just how it works. That's how markets work. And so with a situation like Jackson or Flint, I think that this is where you need to take a really heavy hand with federal intervention, like pretty immediate.
I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that. Otherwise, we got about 5 minutes left here. If there's any questions from the audience, anyone brave enough to grab the microphone, feel free.
I have one question. Just anecdotally, hearing a lot about snowpack in California, I think you mentioned
Sure, yeah, I'll give some perspective.
For anyone who, did everyone hear the question? It's just
Oh.
how much does the snowpack help cure the current deficit, essentially?
Yeah, so the last 2 years, 2022 versus 2023, the winters, great sort of stark contrast on just the swings you see in water. So 2022 across the West was one of the drier years we've seen in a long time, but particularly in California. And then 2023, winter happens, and the Sierra Nevada mountains in particular, which is the sort of central eastern side of California, just got hammered. I mean, if you were skiing or anything, like, there were lifts closed for weeks. I mean, there's just too much snow to ski. And it just got so much snow. Utah was similar, I think, well over 500 inches of snowpack in much of the Wasatch Front. The Rockies did well. So, like, across the West, we had a great snow year. Snowpack is our best reservoir. It holds all this precipitation that falls over months and then releases it over a series of the summer months. It is how we survive a lot in the West, is this snowpack. And to your question, I'm getting to it. The snowpack that fell across the West is going to really, really, really help out California's drought situation. So a lot of the reservoirs in California are going to top off. The State Water Project, which runs all the way from north of Sacramento all the way down to LA and San Diego, that's going to give 100% allocation this year. The average allocation is somewhere around 50%, 40-50%. They're going to get 100% allocation, meaning they get every little bit. So these reservoirs across California pretty much are going to top off. California is going to be in great shape moving forward. Going back to the Colorado River Basin, the good snowpack year is going to be about this much benefit compared to that much deficit. Like, it was 20 years in the making, this sort of use of those storage reservoirs. So this good snowpack year is helpful, but it's going to be sort of a fractional benefit to the overall problem in those two big reservoirs. So that's some perspective, I guess. California's going to do great. The Colorado River Basin is only going to see a little bit of benefit in terms of solving the problem.
We're done. All right. Well, there is a Huva app. Yep. One more, I guess. Brett's telling me, okay. One more.
So I started with a different question. I'm going to see if I can tackle those into what you ended with. You started the panel talking about the decline in consumption of water, and I'm wondering if that you got into the supply and demand issues, and I'm wondering if that is because of the affordability, and that's a sort of major influence. The question I started with initially was a sort of trend and cultural issue where there was all this research done on how much water it takes to produce a cow, for example, and for a food resource and also for milk. And there's a plant-based milk company that says no cow on the side of the container. People have moved more to becoming, we have now Beyond Meat and all the different plant-based meat products. And we have all those milk products that are plant-based, and people become vegan or people are vegan. So I'm wondering if that has also contributed to the decline in consumption, or is it really about the just dollars and cents?
I can help a little bit. I can tell you that we've had increasing population, but our per capita use has steadily declined. So even though we have like 1 million more people in my district, we're using about the same amount of water total. And that's due, I think, a lot towards people, I think, have more awareness about conservation just generally, but also technology has been our friend. Much more efficient, from toilets to dishwashers, you name it. There's just a lot more focus on it. We have Florida-friendly landscaping, Florida Water Star. We're encouraging water-efficient appliances. So I think there's just more awareness, and utilities are motivated because while they make money selling the water, there is a limited amount. So those alternatives get really expensive. So I think there's just an overall more recognition. What people are eating or doing, there is a cost associated with Grass-fed cows may not, I mean, there is a cost to that because of the crops needed to provide that feed. So it's kind of in some of those cases where people, eating habits and other things have changed, or there is a cost because you're maybe replacing, dairy with,
Almonds.
yeah, and there's, and we've seen an increase in, as we've had in Florida, some citrus issues related to citrus greening. People have switched some of those to like blueberries, but blueberries is a high demand water crop. So I don't think people realize when you start switching things out, there's a cost to it in terms of water.
Yeah. So there is a rate the session on the Hoover app, and I've been asked to encourage everybody to go do that now before you leave, so it's fresh in your mind. And with that, I would like to just give a round of applause to these excellent panelists. Thank you, everyone.